Welcome to this journey through one of the most horrifying cases in recorded history, which happened in rural Tennessee. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story.
We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in.
In the fall of 1953, the small farming community of Millfield Hollow, which is located in eastern Tennessee in the shadow of the Cumberland Mountains, became the scene of what investigators would later call one of the most psychologically complicated cases in the region's documented history. The events surrounding the Tinsley family property would stay mostly hidden in county records until 1967, when a graduate student looking into rural Tennessee genealogy found a bunch of letters, medical reports, and testimonies that showed a pattern of psychological manipulation that lasted for almost 20 years. When their father, Jeremiah Tinsley, died in March 1953, the Tinsley sisters, Cordelia and Magnolia, who were 28 and 26 years old, inherited the family's 100-acre farm. The county's probate records show that the sisters had lived on the remote property for their entire adult lives, taking care of their father, who had become more and more reclusive after their mother died of pneumonia in 1941. Neighbors said they were smart but strange women who didn't leave their property very often, except to get necessities and go to church every other Sunday. The farm was at the end of a narrow dirt road that went through thick hardwood forest for almost 3 miles before reaching the main county highway. It was very lonely. Mrs. Beulah Carmichael, who lived 2 miles away and was the closest neighbor, later said that she might not see either sister for weeks, even though they lived close by rural standards. The Tinsley property had a big barn, a main farmhouse built in the 1892s, and several outbuildings. The fields had been left to grow wild over the years as Jeremiah's health got worse. The Tinsley sisters were different from other isolated farming families, not because they were reclusive, but because of what county medical records would later show about their strange living situation. Until he retired in 1959, Dr. Horace Peton was the only doctor in the area. He kept detailed records of his visits to the Tinsley farm. These records, found in 1964 while cleaning out his old office, showed a pattern of visits from 1,945 to 1,958 that showed the sisters' behavior getting stranger and their medical histories becoming less consistent. Dr. Peton's notes say that Cordelia, the older sister, was too protective of Magnolia. For example, she would often answer questions directed at the younger woman and insist on being present during all medical exams. It was even more concerning that he thought Magnolia's cognitive function had gotten worse over the years, even though she was still young and had no known neurological condition. In his notes from 1947, he says she was articulate and responsive. In his notes from 1955, he says she spoke like a child and needed her sister's help with even the simplest of decisions. The first official sign that something was very wrong came in June 1953, 3 months after their father's death, when Cordelia went to Dr. Peton's office alone and asked for medicine for what she said were Magnolia's episodes of confusion and violent outbursts. She said that her sister had been having a lot of anxiety and what looked like memory problems since their father's funeral. Dr. Peton's notes say that he asked to see Magnolia in person, but Cordelia said that travel was impossible because her sister was sick and there was no reliable transportation. Dr. Peton thought it was very strange that Cordelia knew so much about medical terms and could describe her symptoms with such clinical accuracy. She talked about Magnolia's dissociative episodes and how her emotions were more unstable than usual. The way she talked about them didn't seem to fit with her rural background and lack of formal schooling. Cordelia said she knew this because she had been reading medical books that she had borrowed from a relative who worked at a hospital in Knoxville. However, county library records showed no proof that she had borrowed them. From the summer to the fall of 1953, Cordelia went to Dr. Peton's office once a month, always by herself, and asked for changes to Magnolia's medication schedule. She said that her sister's health was getting worse and worse, and that Magnolia couldn't dress herself, cook, or even have a simple conversation without getting upset. Dr. Peton's notes show that he was getting more worried about treating a patient he couldn't see directly. However, He kept prescribing sedatives and anxiety medications based on Cordelia's reports because she seemed very dedicated to taking care of her sister, and it was hard for him to visit them in their remote location. Dr. Piton prescribed a combination of barbiturates and early tranquilizers that were becoming more common for treating anxiety and what were then called nervous disorders. However, looking at pharmacy records from that time shows that Cordelia was getting much more of these drugs than a single patient, even one who was very mentally ill, should have. When asked about the differences, she said that Magnolia often spilled or lost her pills because she was confused, so she needed bigger prescriptions to make sure she got the right treatment. Mrs. Carmichael, the closest neighbor, later gave evidence that went against a lot of what Cordelia said about Magnolia's health. In a statement she gave to county officials in 1959, she said that she saw Magnolia working in the garden in the summer of 1954, and that she seemed alert and able to do complicated tasks. Once, while both women were picking wild blackberries along the property line, she and Magnolia talked for a short time. Mrs. Carmichael said that Magnolia was quiet but very smart during this meeting. However, she did say that Magnolia seemed nervous and kept looking back at the farmhouse while they were talking. Mrs. Carmichael's observation of lights in the Tinsley farmhouse during the late evening hours was even more concerning. From her own land, she could see the faint light of kerosene lamps moving through the house well after midnight on many occasions. When she told Cordelia about this by chance at the general store, Cordelia said that Magnolia's condition kept her from sleeping and that she often spent the night wandering the house in a confused state, needing constant supervision. The pattern continued into 1955 and 1954, with Cordelia continuing to see Dr. Peton regularly, while insisting that Magnolia's condition made it impossible for her to be examined directly. During this time, county officials were told about a number of worrying events, but none of them were looked into at the time. A traveling salesman said that in the spring of 1955, he knocked on the door of the Tinsley farmhouse and heard what sounded like a woman inside the house calling for help. When Cordelia opened the door, she said that her sister was having one of her episodes and apologized for any trouble. The salesman said that Cordelia was blocking his view of the house and that she seemed very nervous the whole time they were talking. Eugene Hartwell, the postal carrier, said that it had become stranger and stranger to deliver mail to the Tinsley farm. Cordelia had asked that all mail be left in a box at the end of the long driveway instead of being brought to the house. She said that visitors who came by without warning made her sister's condition worse. Mr. Hartwell said that he never saw Magnolia during his deliveries after the spring of 1954, even though he had talked to both sisters often in the past. When he asked Cordelia how her sister was doing, she gave him more and more detailed answers about how Magnolia's mental health was getting worse and how she needed to be completely alone with no outside stimulation. In November 1955, the situation got really bad when Cordelia called Dr. Piton and asked for immediate medical help. She said that Magnolia had had what looked like a serious mental breakdown and needed to be hospitalized. But when Dr. Piton got to the farm with plans for emergency transportation to the state hospital in Nashville, Cordelia met him at the door and told him that the crisis was over. She said that Magnolia had been clear-headed for a short time and was now resting comfortably, but she was still too weak to travel or be examined. Dr. Piton's notes from this visit show that he is becoming more and more suspicious about what is going on. He noticed that the farmhouse looked strangely tidy and that there was no sign of the violent incident Cordelia had talked about. Cordelia told him that Magnolia was heavily sedated and that any disturbance could cause another episode when he asked to see her, even from a distance. Dr. Piton, on the other hand, said he heard movement and what sounded like muffled voices coming from the upper floor of the house, even though Cordelia said Magnolia was unconscious from the drugs. After this visit, Dr. Piton started to keep better records of his worries. He noticed that Cordelia's descriptions of her sister's symptoms didn't always match up, especially when she gave conflicting information about when and how bad different episodes were. He also became more and more uneasy about how much medicine he was giving out based only on what other people said. His notes show that he started to think that Magnolia's problems might be caused by taking too many medications instead of a mental illness. An unexpected source gave us the key to understanding what was really going on at the Tinsley farm. In February 1956, a surveyor was measuring land near the Tinsley property for the county to update property lines. While he was doing this, he saw something that would later be very important in finding out the truth. He saw a woman hanging laundry behind the house while he was working in the woods next to the farm. He thought it was strange that the woman seemed to be moving normally and quickly, finishing the job without showing any signs of the debilitating condition that Cordelia had told Dr. Piton and others about. Later, the surveyor Marcus Whitfield said that he had been watching this activity for several minutes from his hidden spot in the tree line. He saw the woman, whom he thought was Magnolia because of how she looked, hanging laundry, feeding chickens, and doing other normal household chores with ease. More importantly, he noticed that she seemed to be looking around nervously, as if she was worried about being watched. The woman dropped what she was doing and rushed inside through the back door when a door slammed at the front of the house. Whitfield's observation made him go back to the area several times during his survey work. During the week, he wrote down several times when he saw Magnolia working outside the house when Cordelia was known to be away from the property. His notes, which he later gave to the county, said that Magnolia looked physically healthy and mentally alert during these observations. This was the opposite of what Cordelia had been telling doctors about her severe mental disability. The consequences of these observations were unsettling. If Magnolia could function normally in the absence of her sister, it indicated that her reported condition was somehow linked to Cordelia's presence. Whitfield's testimony also made people wonder why Cordelia had been getting so much medicine for her sister. One thing that came up from these observations was the idea that Magnolia was being drugged on purpose to keep her dependent and confused. In the spring of 1956, county officials tried to look into these problems, but they ran into a lot of problems. Cordelia wouldn't let anyone officially check out the property or talk to Magnolia directly because she thought it would make her sister's mental state worse and cause a severe psychological episode. She gave medical proof from Dr. Piton that complete isolation and little stimulation were necessary. County officials couldn't do anything more about the case because they didn't have any solid proof of wrongdoing, and the legal frameworks of the time didn't allow them to look into family situations any further. Dr. Piton, on the other hand, grew more and more uneasy with the situation and decided to stop prescribing medication for Magnolia without seeing her in person. When Cordelia came to his office in June 1956 to ask for a renewal of her sister's prescriptions, he told her that medical ethics required him to see the patient in person before continuing treatment. Cordelia's response to this demand was very strong. "Doctor?" Piton's notes say that she got upset and started making accusations, saying that if he didn't keep taking his medicine, her sister would die from the psychological trauma. The fight in Dr. Piton's office showed parts of Cordelia's personality that she had been hiding behind her mask of a devoted caregiver. People who were waiting later said they heard loud voices and what sounded like threats. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, the receptionist for Dr. Piton, said that Cordelia told the doctor he was not doing his job and threatened to report him to the medical board for giving bad care. Her reaction seemed too strong for a simple request to see the patient directly. After this happened, Cordelia seems to have looked for medical help for Magnolia from places outside the county. Pharmacy records show that she started getting prescriptions from a doctor in Cookeville, which is almost 60 miles away. She said that her sister needed specialized care that wasn't available nearby. Local residents who saw Cordelia come and go from mid-1956 to 1957 were even more worried about the frequency of these trips and the fact that she kept buying large amounts of sedative drugs. Several people who lived nearby said they saw changes on the Tinsley property that made them think something big was going on. Mrs. Carmichael said that the garden, which had been taken care of during the years when Magnolia was supposed to be sick, fell into disrepair. The vegetables that had been carefully cared for in the summer of 1956 were left to rot in the fields, and no new planting took place the next spring. Also, it looked like the general upkeep of the farm buildings was getting worse quickly, with repairs not being done and equipment being left outside to rust. More worryingly, neighbors started saying that they no longer saw any signs of Magnolia on the property. The laundry hanging or movement in the garden that had been happening off and on throughout 1956 stopped completely. When asked directly about her sister's health, Cordelia gave answers that got longer and more complicated from a medical point of view. She said that Magnolia had a complete mental breakdown and needed care 24 hours a day, which kept her from going outside or being around other people. Eugene Hartwell, the mailman, saw more changes during this time. Mail delivery, which had been regular for the past few years, became less reliable and sometimes didn't get picked up for weeks at a time. When he saw Cordelia, she looked more and more disheveled and spoke with what he called nervous intensity about her sister's worsening health and the huge burden of having to care for her all the time. She said she had to give medications at certain times during the day and night, and talked about how tired she was from not getting enough sleep for months. In the fall of 1957, Reverend Samuel Ashford, a traveling preacher, stopped by the Tinsley farm without telling anyone. He was on his way to other rural communities. His report to the county religious authorities after that gave one of the most disturbing first-hand accounts of what was happening on the farm. Reverend Ashford's written testimony says that Cordelia first wouldn't let him into the house because her sister was sick and couldn't have any visitors. But because he kept trying to comfort her spiritually, she finally agreed to a short visit. Reverend Ashford said that the inside of the house was very strange, with what looked like a medical setup in one of the bedrooms. He saw several bottles of medicine, feeding tools, and restraints that Cordelia said were needed to keep her sister from getting violent. When he asked to pray with Magnolia, Cordelia took him to a dark room where he saw a woman lying still in bed as if she were unconscious or heavily sedated. Reverend Ashford was most upset by the fact that the woman in the bed looked like she was being held down by leather straps that were tying her wrists to the bed frame. When he asked about this, Cordelia said that her sister's mental illness made her hurt herself when she was confused and that the restraints were needed to keep her safe. Reverend Ashford, on the other hand, said that the restraints looked like they were there to stay, not just for a short time to keep people safe. Reverend Ashford also noticed that the woman in the bed, even though she looked unconscious, seemed to be in bad shape. Her skin was pale and unhealthy, and she looked like she had lost a lot of weight since he last saw her at the farm a few years ago. Cordelia told him that her sister's mental health had made her refuse to eat, and that sometimes she had to be forced to eat to keep from starving. After visiting the Tinsley farm, Reverend Ashford called county officials to tell them about his worries about what he had seen. In his official complaint, which he filed in October 1957, he said that he thought his sister was systematically abusing and imprisoning Magnolia Tinsley. But the investigation that followed ran into the same problems that had stopped previous ones. Cordelia would not let anyone officially check out Magnolia or the property, and county officials did not have the legal power to force their way in just because of the concerns that had been raised. Through the winter of 1957 and into 1958, things stayed in this scary stalemate. County records show that several agencies tried to look into what happened at the Tinsley farm, but Cordelia wouldn't help and there wasn't any direct proof of criminal activity, so each investigation was stopped. At this time, the laws that protected vulnerable adults were very basic, and families had a lot of freedom, even when abuse was suspected. No one could have predicted how the case would end. A strong storm system moved through eastern Tennessee in March 1958, bringing tornadoes that did a lot of damage to the area. One of these tornadoes hit the Tinsley farm directly, destroying the barn and badly damaging the farmhouse. When emergency responders arrived to check on storm damage, they found things that would finally reveal the truth about what had been going on at the remote property. When volunteer firefighters and emergency workers got to the Tinsley farm, they found Cordelia in a lot of pain. She said her sister had been hurt in the storm and needed medical help right away. But when they got to the damaged farmhouse, they found Magnolia in a way that shocked even these seasoned emergency responders. Reverend Ashford had seen her in the upstairs bedroom, where she was physically restrained and very malnourished and dehydrated. The medical exam that came after showed how much had been done to Magnolia over the years. Dr. Robert Hensley, who was called in to give emergency care, wrote down proof of long-term physical restraint, systematic overmedication, and intentional lack of nutrition. His medical report, which he gave to the county, said that Magnolia's condition was consistent with being in prison for a long time and being abused. Blood tests showed that she had very high levels of barbiturates and other sedative drugs in her system, which were much higher than what would be needed for treatment. Even more troubling was the proof that Magnolia's mental state had been changed on purpose by giving her drugs that made her brain work less well and made her depend on them. Dr. Hensley's examination indicated that her alleged mental illness had been artificially induced and sustained through meticulously regulated medication and isolation. The restraints in her room showed signs of long-term use, which means she had been physically locked up for a long time. When Magnolia was in the hospital and slowly stopped taking the drugs that had been keeping her mental state stable, her true condition became clear. She was still able to think clearly and give testimony about her treatment, even though years of abuse had made her weaker. Her story about life on the farm showed that there had been a planned effort to control her mentally and physically since their father's death in 1953. Magnolia testified in several sessions as her physical and mental health got better that Cordelia had started giving her drugs soon after they got the farm. Cordelia said the drugs were needed to help her deal with her anxiety about their father's death. But the doses had been slowly raised over time, and what had started as a way to treat her had turned into a way to keep full control over her behavior and mental state. Magnolia said that people told her she had a very bad mental illness that needed constant medication and being kept away from outside stimulation. Cordelia had made her believe that if she tried to leave the house or talk to anyone outside, she would completely lose her mind and die. The physical restraints had been put in place slowly, as if they were necessary to keep Magnolia from hurting herself during supposed violent episodes that she couldn't remember because of the drugs. The mental abuse was just as bad as the physical abuse. Cordelia had methodically eroded Magnolia's perception of reality and autonomy, persuading her that she was incapable of fundamental tasks and wholly reliant on her sister's care. Any moments of clarity or attempts to resist were seen as signs of mental illness, which meant more medication and stricter control. It was still unclear why Cordelia did what she did, but looking into the family's money problems showed that there were important reasons. Cordelia, the older daughter, got control of the farm and its assets, but only if she promised to take care of her younger sister. Court papers showed that if Magnolia were found to be incompetent or unable to take care of herself, Cordelia would get full control of the inheritance for the rest of her life. Cordelia had also been collecting and controlling disability payments from the government for Magnolia based on reports of her mental health. The news that Cordelia had been abusing her sister for a long time shocked the small town and made people wonder how this could have gone on for almost 5 years without anyone doing anything about it. The case showed how easy it is for family members to abuse people who are alone, and how hard it is for medical and social services to protect victims who are kept away from other people. Cordelia was taken into custody and charged with several crimes, such as assault, fraud, abuse of a vulnerable adult, and imprisonment. But the legal process showed how hard it was to prosecute these kinds of cases in the 1,950 seconds. The laws about mental health were not very good, and people like Magnolia didn't have very good rights. Cordelia's defense team also said that she had acted out of real concern for her sister's health and that she had been following medical advice when she gave her sister care and medicine. The trial, which started in November 1958, got a lot of attention from both the local media and legal experts who were interested in the new field of family abuse prosecution. Testimony showed that Cordelia was very good at manipulating and controlling people, and that she had been lying to medical professionals and community members about her sister's condition in a planned way. Dr. Peton talked about how his suspicions grew and how he finally decided to stop giving Cordelia medication. Neighbors also talked about what they saw and what Cordelia had said to explain her sister's isolation. Magnolia's own testimony, given after months of recovery and rehabilitation, was probably the most convincing. She talked about both the physical abuse she had suffered and the mental manipulation that made her believe she was weak and mentally ill. Her story showed how Cordelia had planned her control and how she had used family ties and medical authority to keep it. The jury found Cordelia guilty on several counts, and she was given a 15-year prison sentence. But the legal solution didn't fully make up for the years of abuse Magnolia had to deal with. Long-term drug-induced confusion and systematic manipulation caused a lot of psychological damage that needed a lot of rehabilitation, and many of the effects were permanent. It took Magnolia a long time to get better, and she didn't fully recover, even though she got back a lot of her mental abilities after she stopped taking the drugs that had been controlling her mental state The years of psychological abuse had lasting effects. She needed a lot of therapy to get back her sense of independence and to get over the learned helplessness that Cordelia's manipulation had caused. The lasting health problems that would affect her for the rest of her life were also caused by being restrained for too long and not getting enough food. To pay for Magnolia's medical care and rehabilitation, the Tinsley farm was sold. She then moved in with distant relatives in a nearby county. For the rest of her life, she kept a low profile, rarely talking about what happened and staying out of the public eye when it came to the case. People who knew her while she was getting better said she was smart and capable, but she always seemed tired, which showed how much trauma she had been through while living with Cordelia. The case had bigger effects on how similar situations were seen and dealt with. Medical professionals started making rules for checking on patients' health by looking at them directly instead of just relying on what family members said. Legal protections for vulnerable adults got better, but it took a long time, and there were still many gaps for decades. The Tinsley case showed how predatory family members could use medical authority and social isolation to keep victims under their control. This was perhaps the most important thing that came out of it. The way Cordelia manipulated people, such as by using medical language and lying to healthcare providers in a systematic way, showed new kinds of abuse that had not been recognized or understood before. After the Tinsley farm case, county records show that there were several other investigations that were started because of what was found there. Social workers and doctors started to look at situations where people were living alone with family members more closely, especially when they couldn't or weren't allowed to talk to the patient directly. But there weren't many resources or legal tools available for intervention, and other cases of long-term family abuse probably went unnoticed. Cordelia spent 11 years in prison before being released on parole in 1969. Records from prison show that she continued to say she was innocent while she was there, saying that her actions were motivated by real medical concerns for her sister's well-being. She always said that she didn't abuse or manipulate anyone on purpose. Instead, she painted herself as a devoted caregiver who was overwhelmed by her sister's complicated mental health needs. After she got out of prison, Cordelia moved to a different part of Tennessee and changed her name. Parole records show where she worked and lived until the mid-1970s, when she was no longer supervised, and her life after that was not documented. People who met her while she was on parole said she was smart and well-spoken, but they also said there was an intensity about her that made them uncomfortable. The psychological assessment, administered during Cordelia's incarceration, indicated a multifaceted personality characterized by narcissistic tendencies and a discernible incapacity to acknowledge the rights and autonomy of others, especially family members. Prison psychologists observed her propensity to justify her controlling behavior as essential care, alongside her adeptness in portraying herself as reasonable and concerned while concealing her manipulative intentions. The evaluation suggestion that Cordelia's behavior was a planned campaign of control rather than an impulsive reaction to the situation was even more troubling. The way she drugged and restrained Magnolia on purpose, along with how she tricked medical professionals and people in the community, showed that she had planned and thought about her actions ahead of time, which made them very disturbing. The Tinsley case had an impact on how doctors, lawyers, and social workers do their jobs in Tennessee and other states. Medical schools started teaching their students about how to manipulate families and why it's important for patients to be able to see their doctors directly. Lawyers push for better protections for adults who are at risk and clearer steps for stepping in when abuse is suspected. The case also showed that people who live alone are still at risk of being taken advantage of by family predators who can use medical systems and social norms about family care to their advantage. The respect for family autonomy that had kept Cordelia from abusing her sister was still strong in American society, making it hard to see and deal with similar situations. Magnolia Tinsley lived until 1989, when she died at the age of 62, from complications of diabetes and heart disease that may have been caused by the long-term effects of her abuse. People who knew her in her later years said that she had found some peace, but that she had never fully gotten over the mental effects of what happened at the farm. She never got married or had kids, and she didn't stay in touch with her extended family very much because they didn't recognize or address her situation while she was in captivity. Her death rekindled interest in the case among legal scholars and abuse researchers who identified the Tinsley situation as a precursor to what would subsequently be recognized as a multifaceted form of domestic abuse characterized by medical manipulation and psychological control. The case is now used in books that teach social workers and healthcare workers how to spot and deal with systematic family abuse. The farmhouse where the abuse happened stayed empty for several years after the trial. It became a part of local stories and was sometimes vandalized. Eventually, developers bought it, tore it down, and divided the land into smaller lots for rural residential development. There is no marker or memorial at the site to show what happened there, and most people who live there now don't know what happened there. A graduate student named Patricia Williamson found the Tinsley case documents in county archives in 1967, almost 10 years after the trial. She was looking into genealogy in rural Tennessee. Her study of the evidence and the academic paper that followed brought new attention to how complex Cordelia's abuse was and what it means for understanding family dynamics and medical manipulation. Williamson's research uncovered supplementary information regarding the case that had not been disclosed during the initial trial. Her review of the family's financial records showed that Cordelia had systematically drained their joint assets while Magnolia was being held captive, turning property and savings into personal accounts that only she could access. The desire to keep control of her sister for financial reasons was even stronger than first thought. Williamson also learned from talking to people who lived in the area that many of them had suspicions about what was going on at the Tinsley farm, but didn't feel like they could do anything about it because of social norms about family privacy and the lack of clear evidence. The conspiracy of silence that kept Cordelia's abuse a secret showed that society as a whole cared more about family autonomy than protecting individuals. The study also found proof that Cordelia may have tried different drugs and doses on her sister, using Magnolia as a test subject to see how different combinations of drugs worked. The tornado left behind medicine bottles in the farmhouse that had traces of drugs that none of the doctors Cordelia had seen had prescribed. This suggests that she got drugs from more than one place and took them without a doctor's supervision. This shocking news made it seem possible that Cordelia's abuse of her sister included intentionally trying out drugs that could change her mind. The systematic way she kept records, which were found among her personal papers, showed that she had been clinically detached while keeping track of how different drug regimens affected Magnolia's behavior and mental state. These discoveries had consequences that went beyond the specific case and raised larger issues about medical ethics and patient safety. The fact that Cordelia could easily get large amounts of controlled substances just by saying that her sister was sick showed that the medical system's protections against abuse were not strong enough. The Tinsley case served as a model for professional medical groups to create new rules for how to examine patients and give them medicine. It became more important for doctors to talk to patients directly before giving them controlled substances, and doctors were taught how to spot signs of possible medication abuse by family caregivers. The case also influenced the development of adult protective services programs that emerged in Tennessee and other states during the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds. Social workers were given training specifically focused on recognizing signs of family abuse and the legal authority to investigate suspected cases, even when family members attempted to prevent access to potential victims. However, the fundamental challenges that had enabled Cordelia's abuse of her sister persisted in various forms. Rural isolation continued to protect family predators, and the belief that families should be free to do what they want kept people from getting involved in cases of suspected abuse. Legal protections for vulnerable adults have changed slowly and in different ways in different places. The Tinsley case became a way to understand how smart and well-spoken abusers could use medical systems and the way people in the community saw them to keep control over their victims. Cordelia's ability to act like a devoted caregiver while systematically taking away her sister's freedom and health showed how sophisticated family abuse could be when the abuser knew how to use social and medical systems to their advantage. Lessons from the Tinsley case about the importance of being skeptical of family reports, of patient conditions, and the need for independent verification of medical needs and treatment compliance started to be used in training programs for healthcare providers, social workers, and police officers. The case showed how predators could use real medical language and procedures to control and abuse people. The psychological dynamics elucidated in the Tinsley case also shaped the evolution of trauma therapy methodologies for individuals subjected to prolonged familial abuse. Magnolia's experience of learned helplessness and reality distortion became part of the literature used to understand how victims could be systematically convinced of their own incompetence and dependency through manipulation of their medical and psychological state. Research into the long-term effects of systematic drugging and psychological manipulation expanded partly in response to questions raised by the Tinsley case. The revelation that sophisticated abuse could be maintained for years without detection by medical professionals prompted studies into the cognitive and emotional damage caused by such treatment and the possibility of recovery after extended periods of control. The case also contributed to broader discussions about the nature of family relationships and the potential for exploitation within supposedly caring dynamics. Cordelia's ability to keep up the appearance of being a caring sister while systematically taking away Magnolia's freedom showed how family ties could be used as weapons against weak people. Legal scholars studying the case noted how Cordelia had exploited not only medical systems, but also social expectations about family loyalty and privacy. Her ability to stop outside interference by saying she was protecting her sister's medical privacy showed how real worries about privacy could be used to cover up abuse. The Tinsley case remained relevant to professionals working with vulnerable adults well into the modern era, as the fundamental dynamics of family manipulation and medical abuse continued to pose challenges for detection and intervention systems. Training materials developed decades after the original case continued to reference the sophisticated nature of Cordelia's manipulation as an example of how family predators could exploit institutional systems. Perhaps most significantly, the case served as a reminder that intelligence, articulateness, and apparent concern for a victim's welfare could mask systematic abuse and exploitation. Cordelia's ability to deceive medical professionals, community members, and even some investigators demonstrated the need for systemic safeguards that went beyond relying on surface impressions or family representations. The isolation of the Tinsley farm had been crucial to enabling years of abuse, but the case also revealed how isolation could be artificially maintained even in communities where potential helpers were available. Cordelia's systematic prevention of outside contact with her sister demonstrated how predators could create psychological and physical barriers that effectively isolated victims, even when they were not geographically remote. The gradual nature of Magnolia's subjugation, beginning with supposedly therapeutic medication and evolving into complete physical and psychological control, illustrated how abuse could escalate over time in ways that made intervention increasingly difficult. At first, it looked like Cordelia was getting real medical care, which made it hard for people to tell when the treatment turned into abuse. The financial motivation underlying Cordelia's actions added another layer of complexity to the case, demonstrating how economic incentives could drive family members to maintain control over vulnerable relatives through medical manipulation. Cordelia had strong reasons to stop her sister from getting better or becoming independent because of problems with her inheritance and disability payments. The Tinsley case became a landmark in understanding family abuse, not because it was the worst case of such treatment, but because it showed how smart predators could keep control over their victims without being found by medical and social systems. The case showed how abuse could be hidden in plain sight by using real institutions and social norms to do so. Years after the original events, the questions raised by the Tinsley case continued to challenge professionals working to protect vulnerable adults. How could medical systems verify patient conditions without violating legitimate privacy concerns? How could social services step in when they think abuse is happening without interfering with the family's freedom? How could communities recognize complex manipulation that pretended to be loving family ties? The answers to these questions took decades to come up with, but the basic conflicts between protection and freedom, intervention and privacy, are still important in modern practice. The Tinsley case reminded us that protecting weak people needs more than just good intentions. It also needs planned protections against manipulation and a deep understanding of how abuse can use legitimate systems and relationships to its advantage. In the end,